Hello, it is June 9th, 2019, and welcome to the Junto Podcast Club, Episode 4, Season 1. And I'm Dan Van Gordon, and this is...
I'm Brett McNeil, and today we'd like to welcome Professor Stephen Farrell. If you're not familiar, Stephen's body of works include the Last Papers, the Irish Papers, and most notably Mercy Boys. His travels have taken him all the way from the corners of the earth from Japan to Saudi Arabia, where he's taught. Welcome, Professor Farrell.
Thank you for having me on the show, guys. Good to talk to you both.
Likewise.
Well, Stephen, we kind of have a couple of your books out here because, we're kind of doing some light reading. And I have noticed that you do delve into Irish American history a bit. Is that true?
Yeah, that's my number one interest in my studies and research.
So what really interested you in the Irish American experience?
Well, I grew up in a very Irish American family, and we were very proud of our heritage. But coming from Kenosha, everything was basically Italian heritage, German heritage, and Polish heritage. So we kind of went out and looked for our own heritage, and a lot of that was kind of going to the old movies with James Cagney, doing a lot of reading, and then I've been interested in New York, and I've been in New York in the old Irish neighborhood. So over the years, it's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and I've actually been to Ireland maybe 4 times now.
And was the last time to film Mercy Boys?
The last time I went to Ireland was to film Mercy Boys in October of 2017.
Now, could you go in a little...
I'm hoping to go over it. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to ask you if you could give us a little run through of Mercy Boys for our listeners out there.
Yeah, Mercy Boys is a novel that I wrote many years ago, and I've rewritten it over the years. And I published it in 2013 under my own imprint of Celtic Badger. And then I hooked up with an Irish director by the name of Paddy Murphy over in Limerick, Ireland. Paddy's film company is also Celtic Badger Media Films. And I just happened to find it online, and I emailed him, and that started a dialogue between us. And then I said, well, I've written a book called Mercy Boys. I'd like you to take a look at it. So I sent it to him and my screenplay, and he really liked it. But it took about 2 years before we could actually get everything set up so I could go to Ireland and film it. He actually rewrote the script. He took a portion of what I wrote, the first couple of pages, and he rewrote it. And that's the script we used when I went over to Ireland. And it kind of is kind of a prequel to my book. It kind of sets it up, as it were.
Definitely. Now, when you were casting for characters, how did you go about finding the right people to play these roles?
Okay, what they did was they put out a casting call in Limerick. And Limerick actually has a school for acting. So many of the people who auditioned were people who were going to that college in Limerick. But Paddy Murphy was good friends with Jessica Messenger. He had worked with her before on other film projects. She actually is situated over in Manchester, England. So he asked her to fly over to play the part of Jenny. And then I think he was at a film festival, and he met the young man named Fiach Koons, who played Al Moran. He met him at this film festival, and he had him in mind for Al Moran because Al Moran's an American, and Fiach Koons can do an American accent. Also, it helped that Fiach Koons' uncle owned a pub down in Wicklow, Ireland, and that's the pub we used for the film. So that kind of helped us.
Any relation to Bugs Moran?
Well, that's exactly where I got the name from. When I came up with the name, I took Bugs Moran, and people asked him in the book, are you related to Bugs Moran? But he really wasn't. But I also took the name Al from Al Capone, and oddly enough, there's a lot of references in the book to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. that's kind of my inside joke, I guess.
It's funny. You mentioned Al Capone, and it actually makes me kind of think about the Irish American mob in the United States too. Which I actually, when it comes to Irish history and Irish American history, the two most fascinated elements to me were always the IRA and the Irish mob. And those are my two biggest interests. And do you think those two things really shape the Irish American experience too? And
oh, definitely. When you get a chance, I actually have online an article called "Mickey Machine Gun is Back: The Return of the Irish American Gangster to the Silver Screen," and it was printed by a magazine called Crime Magazine, and it does trace the history of the Irish American gangsters. They used to say that back in old Irish America, that either you were going to become a gangster, a priest, or a cop. Those were your three options in life. And in some ways it might have been true, like in New York and Chicago. But I don't know if you guys have ever been to Chicago, but you could actually track down a lot of those places where the North Side Gang hung out, where Jaime Weiss got killed, the garage where Bugs Moran's men were killed for the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. That's now long gone. And if you go to New York City, there are still traces of the old, the Westies were the Irish mob that was still around back in the 1980s. And I forget the name of the bar, but it's on the west side, maybe like, 8th Street or something. And it's still there, still same name, and it still looks the same. Also, the IRA, I guess that goes back to the Troubles in Ireland. Probably everybody who came from Ireland suffered one way or another because of the Troubles, between the English, the Irish Catholics, the Irish Protestant. But I remember for years there were certain places, even in Kenosha, when they would have Irish bands, they would tell the musicians, don't sing any IRA music. And even when I lived in Boston, that was true. Don't sing any IRA. You could sing Irish songs, but don't sing anything that glorifies the IRA.
I was going to ask you about. Sorry. Now I was going to ask you a question. Something that's always jogged my mind about Irish Americans, and it's something I've always noticed about groups in the United States that typically face a lot of discrimination, and the Irish were one of them.
Mm-hmm.
They always seem to gravitate towards political power. The Kennedys and a lot of families out east, a lot of the prominent political families seem to be Irish American. And I always wonder why that was. Could you elaborate on why Irish Americans tend to have a lot of political power?
Well, I think when they came over, they start moving into the big cities, and then the people who were there before them started to move out. So the Irish figured, well, the best way we can get ourselves jobs is through the political system. And once we control the political system, we can maybe control the police force, we control the fire force. And that was about the time labor unions started to come along. So they figured, well, we'll control all of these things, and this is the way we'll employ our people. Plus, I think even before they came to America, over in Ireland, because of the situation with the English, the Irish basically had their own secret government that was kind of beneath. The English didn't really pay attention to them, but they were very well organized. And I think they brought that organization over to the United States, maybe even going back to ancient times when they had the clan systems of Ireland. And the Irish were also great talkers and giving speeches. They enjoyed doing that. But one thing you have to remember, too, Dan, one skill the Irish did have is they could make deals with the other ethnic groups. They could connect with the Jewish voters. They could connect with the Italians, the Polish, the Germans. And the other ethnic groups weren't at that point yet where they could kind of reach across, neighborhoods and make deals with each other. So that definitely came into their advantage. And also many Irish settled on the East Coast, the big cities, Philadelphia, New York, Pittsburgh, and Boston. And really, the end of Irish America as far as geographically goes, it probably ended somewhere between St. Louis and Kansas City. all the big cities. That's basically where the Irish settled.
Now I got a question for you, Professor Farrell.
Yeah, sure.
What brought you to Japan and Saudi Arabia?
Okay, I was teaching in Texas A&M many, many years ago, and I had met a guy I worked in my department with who had just been to Thailand for a couple of years, and he made it sound like the greatest experience in the world. He goes, Steve, before you get old, go teach overseas. So I kind of applied for a job, and I was surprised they offered it to me. I went over to Japan with the idea I would stay 1 year, and then I ended up staying 5 years. And then when I came back to Kenosha in the mid-'90s, I really had trouble getting a good job. The only job I really could get was working at Parkside, and that was part-time. And I did that for a while, and finally I said, I have to move on with my life. I got to make some money. And then I was offered a job over in Saudi Arabia at Aramco oil company, and I worked there for a year, and I went back to Kenosha. This was about 1999, and I was about ready to go over to Kuwait to teach at a university over there. Would you believe it? I saw an advertisement in the paper for Holy Rosary, and I applied for it.
Wow.
They hired me, and I thought I'd stay 1 year, and I stayed 7.
And you got the whole Bertina experience.
Yeah. And you know they're not going to close it, Brett. Do you know that?
What? No, I didn't know that.
They were going to close it, and then they decided to close St. Mary's instead. So they're keeping Holy Rosary up.
I think they made the right call.
We were just talking about this like 15 minutes ago.
Really?
Yeah, we were. I mean, I'm not originally from Kenosha. I'm originally from Milwaukee. But, you know, obviously the Catholic Church had a big presence there. Not so much Irish Americans. There wasn't a lot of those.
More like German and Polish, maybe.
Basically, north side German, south side Polish, and Jews and Italians on the east side.
Mm-hmm.
Now, question for you, did you get married when you were in Japan?
Yeah, I was married briefly over in Japan,
Mm-hmm.
and her name was Masami.
Masami. Wow.
Yeah.
Was it difficult to learn dialect there?
Oh, I mostly just spoke English, and Masami could speak English.
Well, that helps.
I did learn some Japanese, but never anything great. I mean, I could hold my own. I could have conversations, but I got lost if the Japanese got too complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And one time when I was in Ireland years later, there were some Japanese people standing next to me, and I was surprised. I definitely could follow their conversation. I knew what they were talking about. But now, after all these years, Brad, I think my Japanese is completely disintegrated.
But maybe you should learn Gaelic now. You could really fit in Ireland.
Well, yeah, I do know they're required to take Gaelic over in Ireland, but I don't know if many people actually use it in their daily lives. I think the only place you'll actually find it spoken is like on the Aran Islands or very remote villages like on the west part of Ireland. By the way, that's where we filmed most of Mersey Boys, the movie. We filmed part of it on the west side of Ireland in Galway. Mm-hmm. Then part of it we filmed on the other side of Ireland, just south of Dublin in Wicklow.
Why do they call it a Galway girl? Do you have any idea?
A Galway girl? Well,
Yeah.
I guess that would be girl from Galway.
Okay.
I guess that's the only thing I don't know.
Another question I had, since we're talking about Ireland and we're talking about your films, I have a very good friend that lives in Belfast, and he's half Indonesian and half Irish. Mm-hmm. But he's a very proud Northern Irishman, a very proud Ulster. Do you, as an Irish American or being Irish in general, do you consider Northern Irish people, Scots Irish, to be part of the Irish culture, or is it almost totally separate? Because I feel like on the one hand, you guys are cut from the same cloth, but on the other hand, there's just so much division and hatred.
Yeah, I'd like to think of them as one, even if they're not united as one political country. I do think their cultures are so similar. Their traditions are the same. They've shared the same island for 400 years. And if you go over to Ireland, they don't even use the word Scot-Irish. That's an American invention, but they refer to themselves as Ulstermen or North of Ireland. And they're very proud to be British, and I understand that. So I kind of, rather than fight about it, well, let's just, what do we have in common? You know, we have this island, and we both like rugby, we both like, football, we like Guinness. So let's look at what unites us, you know.
I believe their rugby team is united, but for soccer, for football, it's divided. Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland have two separate teams. The rugby, they have one. Do you think maybe down the road, maybe they'll have one football team? Like that would help?
It could. Well, you know, another thing, too, is that the British are talking about leaving the European Union, and the Northern Irish don't want to leave the European Union, and the Irish are still in the European Union. So we don't know what's going to develop down the road. Also, you made a good point about your friend being half North Irish and half Indonesian. There are now a lot of immigrants in Ireland, a lot of people from Poland, a lot of people from other countries. I'm trying to think if it was like if they're from West Indians or what. But it seems like the Irish are getting a lot of people from other countries now are moving there. So in a way, I'm kind of hoping they get behind all that orange and green stuff. It's kind of time to put it in the past.
What does their political climate look like out there?
Oh, I think it's looking a lot better than it has. But I'll tell you, the Irish are very liberal compared to us as far as like politics and stuff. They lean more to the left than to the right. But it seems like they're... What's that?
Oh, I was going to say, that really surprises me, because didn't they just repeal the abortion ban that they had in years recently?
Yeah, exactly. They got rid of the abortion, so the abortion would be part of the old Ireland, and the new Ireland's going away from that. Also, the Irish are not as Catholic as they used to be. I think the whole thing with the pre-scandals, et cetera, for whatever reason, the younger people are pushing away from that, pushing back against that old lifestyle, you know, the Catholic Church. At least that was my impression of it.
And I would also say that with them leaving the European Union, now correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're born in Northern Ireland, I believe you can have an Irish and a British passport.
Yes.
And a lot of people feel as though that would hinder the freedom of movement, because I think actually Ireland and the United Kingdom have an agreement that says that they can move freely across that border. And if they leave the European Union, it just deeply complicates it, because Ireland uses the euro. They're part of the EU. So, I mean, is that true? Is that the feeling you got over there from the locals?
Yeah, it could make things very, very complicated. And one industry the English have, I know, that the Irish will probably take away from them. If the British leave the European Union, they will no longer be able to go to the European Union to teach English. Whereas the Irish, who are still part of the European Union, they'll be able to go over there and still do it. And that's a big industry over there. But it's going to get very complicated. I don't know if you guys know, but the Irish use the euro currency. But if you go to Northern Ireland, they use the British pound.
Mm-hmm. The pound's doing better.
So there's a lot of complicated stuff going on with their economies, etc. Also, Scotland wants to stay part of the European Union. And it's just basically, at this point, the English, but I'm kind of thinking they're wavering on it. Maybe we'll see if they'll get themselves back into the European Union. I don't know. That will be very interesting to see.
Imagine if they would have held that referendum after Brexit instead of before it. We might be seeing an independent Scotland today.
To be honest with you, I was kind of pulling for it. And they claimed that the men were in favor of it, but the women wanted to stay with the British because of economical reasons, tradition, etc. But I personally preferred to see independent Scotland. But voters had, they voted it, so that's it. Finished.
It wasn't. I mean, it was close though. I think it was
Yeah, it was very close.
52
and they
to
even
48.
allowed like
I think around
teenagers
there.
to vote that too.
16. Yeah, I think it was 16 years old or older. I think people over the age of 16 could vote for it.
I was also going to say that according to the surveys in Ireland, Northern Ireland, a lot of the Catholics now would vote to stay with Britain. And a lot of the issue was that the Catholics were not being given their civil rights in Northern Ireland. But now that there's more of a guarantee they're going to get them, and there more jobs open up. For years, if you were Catholic, you could not get on the Northern Irish police force, and they've changed that. So as long as things are changing in that way, I don't know if the people really are that interested in joining the Republic.
What other kind of civil rights are you talking of?
What's that?
What other kind of civil rights are you talking about?
In Northern Ireland, Catholics did not have civil rights for a long time. And in 1968, 1969, they began to have demonstrations and marches like we had over here in the United States with Martin Luther King. And that led to violence between the Catholic demonstrators and the British soldiers and the Northern Irish police force, who were predominantly Protestant. And then when things got worse, that's when the IRA kind of came back and revitalized. The IRA had been dormant for many years. They were a very small organization. But during the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland in the late 60s, the Catholics were getting beat up by the police. They were getting beat up by the British soldiers. And that's when the IRA kind of made a bounce back. But now in modern Northern Ireland, I think the Catholics have their civil rights. I don't think they're being, how would you say, tormented. They're terrorized by the British soldiers or the police anymore. So they're not so interested in leaving Britain like they were before. Also, I think, let's face it, Britain's a much richer country than Ireland, so there's no really any benefit to go to the Republic. And their accents are very different, too, that the people, even the Catholics in Northern Ireland, their accent is more similar to the Scottish people. And they don't really feel all that welcome in the Republic. Some people say they find prejudiced if they go down the Republic, even if they're Catholics, because they're Northerners, Northern Irish. Very complicated situation.
So I know that in Northern Ireland, they have walls in the streets to prevent the Protestants and Catholics from going at each other. I mean, is that true? I mean,
yeah.
So in Belfast, there's almost like not a Berlin Wall type situation, but it actually reminds me a lot about Jerusalem between the Muslims and the Jews. So they have walls to separate neighborhoods to just stop the violence, but people still throw stuff over the wall at the other neighbors.
And they have bridges too, and they do have barriers they've set up over the years. I don't know how extensive they are. I do know, I think it's Derry, Londonderry. I turned down the wrong street and I entered this one street. Right painted on the wall was big painting of an IRA guy holding a rifle, and it said, "You're now entering Free Derry." And I do know that one of the issues that still rages is every July 12th, the Protestants have the Orange Parade celebrating William of Orange's victory over the Catholics in 1689. And they intentionally march on this bridge going right through the Catholic part of town. The Catholics get offended by it, so they come out and throw rubbish and rocks at the Protestant paraders. And the police, every year, they try to barricade the Protestants from going in there, but they somehow manage to get through. I don't know how. But I guess it's a way of taunting or trash talking. Hey, we beat you 300 years ago.
Now let's kind of. I could talk about European Union politics all day, but I figured we rewind back to the United States. And so what to me, or what do you think is kind of the most lasting impression of Irish immigrants to the United States, besides St. Patrick's Day? Something we might not think about.
Well, I guess one would be the image of the fighting Irish.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you have a football team, the Notre Dame fighting Irish, then the Celtic, Boston Celtic, kind of the image of Irish being fighters. But I wonder, too, if the lasting impression might be that the Irish had to flee Ireland because of the potato famine. And it seems like even people who don't know anything about Irish history are familiar with the famine and how, anywhere from 1 million Irish people to 2 million Irish people died of starvation, and another 1 million or 2 fled to come to the United States. So if anybody came to this country in worse conditions, except for maybe the African Americans who came over on the slave ships, the Irish probably second that. A horrific story if you ever read about it. In some ways, I think that is the lasting impression of Irish America.
And when you were writing your books, Mercy Boys included, how much of that history did you draw upon to make those books, and what period of history really got you to write your stories?
I think I've always been very influenced by once Irish America kind of came into its own, like 1880s, 1890s, where they were no longer as poor as they were. That you had John L. Sullivan. I wrote a book called Boston Knuckles about John L. Sullivan, the American heavyweight boxer. And he was the first popular culture athlete that everybody in the country knew he was, and he was the first $1 million athlete. He made $2 million in his career. And John L. Sullivan was from Boston, and then a lot of the first early baseball players, probably from about 1880 to about 1910, probably about 50% of the Major League Baseball players were Irish American. And so I was very proud of that, very aware of that. That's always kind of informed my writing. But one thing I was going to tell you, one reason why Al Moran from Mersey Boys was able to connect with the Beatles was he was very Irish-American, very proud of his Irish heritage. But all of the Beatles also had Irish connections. Like George Harrison was predominantly Irish ancestry, and he still had first cousins over in Ireland and had visited Ireland before he became famous. John Lennon's father was Irish ancestry, and Paul McCartney actually grew up in a part of Liverpool called Little Dublin, and he was surrounded by a huge Irish family in Liverpool. He was predominantly Irish. So this was kind of the connection that he could make with them. And for years, they always referred to Liverpool as the capital of Ireland because there were more Irish people in Liverpool than there were in any part of Ireland.
What kind of research did you have to do when writing the Mersey Boys?
Oh, I think I read every book I could find about them. The most popular one I want to say is by a writer by the name of Hunter Davies. But I read books by John Lennon's sister, John Lennon's father, people who knew the Beatles even remotely. And that was kind of one of the ideas I had when I wrote the book is, does Al Moran, did he really do this, or was he BSing? Was he making this up?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, is this just a crazy old man making it up? Kind of, you read these books about, oh yeah, I knew John Lennon when he was a teenager. So it was kind of in that vein, but in the book, every once in a while, I try to throw out something to kind of prove, yeah, he really does know this.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, Brett, did you watch the movie yet?
I have not had an opportunity to.
Okay, at the end of the story, I play a part, Gerard Moran, and I'm in Ireland to bury my uncle who has left this manuscript behind claiming he knew the Beatles, there's letters, etc., and he does not believe it. He just thinks his uncle's BSing, making it up. But lo and behold, he finds an old photograph buried in a desk way in the corner, a picture of Al Moran with John Lennon. and he can't believe it. Okay, because now we see there is some truth to it.
Mm-hmm.
And in the book, Al Moran claims that Paul McCartney wrote the book Uncle Albert. That's probably way before your time, but there's a song called Uncle Albert, and he claims that song was written about him, but it clearly wasn't.
How does just somebody listening to this podcast that might want to learn more about this movie try to get their hands on it, or what can they do?
Okay, well, for right now, it's still we're just kind of shopping it around. Mainly, we're using it to see if we could get a feature film. We want to get a budget for a feature film.
Mm-hmm.
We will put it up on YouTube probably around November. That way, people who want it, they could actually get to it. We hope to get a couple more screenings somewhere in the United States before we actually put it up on YouTube.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and
I mean...
Right now,
well, I was going to say... No, good, carry on.
No, I was going to say that Patty Murphy's hoping to screen it in Limerick, Ireland, sometime later this summer. And I'm in communication with a Beatles museum in Halle, Germany, and hoping they'll play it there. But right now, we're more concerned about trying to get it as a feature, and that's kind of what I'm doing now. I'm actually going through the process of negotiating with Apple Corps. I've been on the phone with them a couple times, and it's kind of difficult to get them to agree anything, but what I want to do is I'm going to agree to pay for the rights to use the music.
Mm-hmm.
But it could be coming out. I'm hoping to start the feature maybe in a year, but it might take 10 years. I don't know.
Do you think the release of that new Beatle movie would probably help you?
I don't know if it's going to help or hurt. You know how it's one of these things that it's kind of renewing interest in the Beatles,
mm-hmm.
but by the time we make our movie, people might say, we're sick of the Beatles, go away. You know, it seems like the Beatles kind of come and go every 10 years, and then people get very excited about them again, then they kind of fade away. So it could go either way. I'm hoping it will actually renew interest in it. But I was going to tell you, Brett, that
mm-hmm.
I was the first one. I actually wrote this book in 1989.
Wow.
So I'm kind of thinking people are going to say, well, Farrell copied all these movies coming out now, but it's not true.
Well, I tell you what, I mean, if we look at the release of that movie about Queen, Bohemian Rhapsody, I mean, you turn on the radio nowadays, all you hear is Queen being played, or whether you hear a commercial. So I think they really struck a chord with people who hadn't heard it, and I mean, we might see Beetle fever here to stay.
Well, a couple months ago, I was down in Florida at Delray for the Beatles on the Beach festival,
mm-hmm.
and the place was jammed, and there were a lot of young people there, and I think they're interested in the Beatles too. So if you could reach out to a younger generation and get them interested. Now, one of the people I met at the festival was a guy by the name of Tony Bramwell, and Tony Bramwell was the CEO for Apple Corps, the Beatles company, and he actually produced a couple of the Beatles songs. I don't know if you're familiar with Strawberry Fields Forever and Lady Madonna. He actually produced those records for him, and he sat in the front row for the movie, and afterwards he hugged me. He said, I loved it. But anyways, I'm trying to actually get him to be the executive director of the movie.
He would be great.
He would be great because he knew the Beatles, and he started off with the Beatles. He was a friend of George Harrison when they were little kids, and then when George got in the band, the Beatles, he would let Tony carry his equipment for him so Tony could get into nightclubs. Then after a while, John Lennon would say, hey, do you mind carrying my equipment? Then after a while, he became the Beatles' first roadie. And then when they became very big, he went along with them and was promoted up the ladder until he became the CEO of the company. Really nice guy.
Who's your favorite Beatle?
I would say John Lennon.
Yeah.
What about you? Do you have a favorite Beatle?
No, I would say I generally don't listen to the Beatles that much, but I do enjoy John Lennon as well.
Paul McCartney. He was just in Chicago, I believe. Or no, Lambeau.
Yeah, and he was just here in Greenville, of all places. He came here a few nights ago, and everybody was asking me, well, did you go see Paul? I go, oh, no, I couldn't afford it.
They're wildly expensive.
Oh, well, when they came out, they were like $115, which I could afford, but quickly people bought them out, and then they were going back up on StubHub for $365.
Yeah.
And I go, oh, I don't think I can afford that.
Have you seen him before?
People said he put out...
Have you got a chance to see any of the members of the Beatles perform?
Okay, I did see George Harrison play in Tokyo, Japan with Eric Clapton. Maybe about 1991, and it was great. And then I saw Ringo Starr play at Summerfest in Milwaukee back, sometime in the mid to late 90s. So I saw Ringo and John, but I never saw Paul, so I would have liked to have seen him. But my sister Pat and my sister Barb, they saw the Beatles play in Milwaukee at the old Milwaukee Arena. It was before the new one where the Bucks play now.
Oh, the Bradley Center.
In fact, the old one was where the Marquette Warriors played.
Right.
And then my sister Pat saw them again about a year later down at White Sox Park in Chicago. So at least somebody in my family has seen all four of the Beatles play.
I was gonna.
But did you?
Oh, sorry.
I was gonna ask Brad, who is? You're saying your favorite Beatle is Paul, right?
Paul McCartney.
All right.
Definitely.
I was gonna ask you a quick thing about the Beatles' impact on the United States in the. I believe they came over in the '60s, technically, or was it the late '50s?
No, they came to America for the first time in 1964.
Okay, so it was the '60s. To me, whenever I think about the Beatles as a pop culture institution, I picture the Beatlemania that was going through the United States when they came over, and how they kind of smashed surf rock into oblivion. The Beach Boys were very popular, and at that time there was kind of that rock and roll style. I think the Beatles actually redefined rock in the United States, and then a slew of other British acts followed. And I was wondering, what do you think in American culture and in music in general, what were the Beatles' biggest contributions?
Well, I think what they did was they took our music, our old rock and roll, and then they mixed it with American R&B, rhythm and blues.
Mm-hmm.
But they were also impacted by country music, American country, so that's in there, and then rockabilly. But then they also put in their own sound, which they called the Mersey beat. And the Mersey beat was unique to Liverpool, and the term was coined by Bill Harry. Anyways, so what they did was they basically reinvented rock, and then they brought that style over to America. Then all our American bands started to copy the Beatles. And so they were Beatles reinterpret American music, and then they reinterpreted it through the Beatles. So you had groups like the Monkees, who were very much more influenced by the Beatles than they were by American rock and roll. They were more influenced by John and Paul than they were by Elvis Presley. And suddenly you had all these bands over in America that were, they sounded more like the Mersey beat than they did the original American rock and roll.
Yeah, because to me, when you look at the music from that time period, it really does seem like that the Beatles' arrival to the United States actually completely changed it. Because, I do think about Elvis Presley, we think about the Beach Boys, pretty much that surf rock, rockabilly, like you said. But then you get the Stones that came later, and I think the Stones are from England as well, but you do hear a heavy R&B influence in their music, and as well as blues. But there's something almost soulful about Liverpool.
Mm-hmm.
There's something, and I think today, that soulful style of music, and I don't know if you're familiar with a lot of singers from Wales. It's like the same thing. They're in the British Isles. There's some kind of obsession with soul music, and then they twist it into their music, like Adele. We think about Adele and some of other smaller female R&B artists that have came out of the United Kingdom. But I feel like that the Beatles really, without them, I mean, I'm sure like country music and rock music today would be almost indistinguishable without the Beatles.
Right.
Exactly. And I was going to say another group that was very influenced by that R&B sound was Led Zeppelin.
Oh yeah,
In
that's
fact,
right.
they were always kind of criticized for taking these old R&B stars like Willie Dixon, and they took their music and they, made it into their own thing, but they never really gave full credit to the people. At least this was the accusation towards them, that they did not give full acknowledgement to the people that they took the music from.
Mm-hmm.
And for whatever reason, I think, Dan, you're completely right. There is something very soulful about England, Liverpool in particular, kind of a dreary town that just seems to be hanging on, crummy weather. They've survived World War II. And after World War II, R&B really resonated with the British, probably more with the British than the white middle class over here in America. I don't think we ever really appreciated the black music as much as the British did.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, when we look back in time here, I mean, the Rolling Stones and the Beatles were all hanging out together before we knew anything about them.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, what a crazy time to be around.
Oh, it must have been incredible. That time period from about 1962, about 1968, about 5-6 year period, England was putting out this incredible music, and all these guys, I think they all did know each other, and they did all influence each other, and they had their little rivalries going on.
Mm-hmm.
But one group that nobody really talks about anymore in the United States was a group called the Dave Clark Five. And they were actually bigger than the Rolling Stones. They were almost rivals to the Beatles. They were the London sound. And then about 66, for whatever reason, they just kind of tailed off. And that's when the Rolling Stones became super big. The Stones were never really considered in that top echelon of British bands until the later 60s, I think.
Did
you guys ever hear it?
What is the Dave Clark Five known for?
I want to hold your
They had
hand.
a song called Glad All Over, Bits and Pieces, Any Way You Want It.
Oh.
If you ever get on YouTube, find the song Any Way You Want It, because it's probably one of the first hard rock, heavy metal. They were very distinguished by they had a very strong drum beat, which the Beatles really didn't have. Ringo was always just kind of an average drummer compared to the drummers like the Rolling Stones had Charlie Watts, and you could just hear him banging on the drums, or Keith Moon of the Who, where Ringo was good, but he was never quite in that same category. And I think Dave Clark was the first of those drummers where the song they put out, the drum, is very distinguished right from the beginning to the end.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, even though I'm not a big Beatles man, I do like 60s music, but I kind of drift towards more Jimi Hendrix. I love Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin, but I also have to acknowledge that without the Beatles, they probably wouldn't have existed. And I believe Jimi Hendrix, his band actually started in London.
Yeah, he did.
I think it did.
In fact, the Beatles would go to his nightclub act, and they did like him. He did know the Beatles. And I don't know if you guys know this, but for a while, Jimi Hendrix actually opened up for the Monkees in the United States.
Oh, I never knew that.
I did not know that.
I would assume to be the other way around.
And what happened was all these teeny boppers would go see the Monkees, then Jimmy would come out there with his guitar, and they would just start screaming, "We want the Monkees, we want the Monkees." And Mickey Dolenz, who was the singer of the Monkees, go, "These kids don't know what they're talking about." He goes, "History will remember Jimi Hendrix more than they'll remember us." And that's actually basically what happened. But I don't know which Beatle. I think it might have been George Harrison was fairly close friends with Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah, you know, that period is a golden era in music, the 60s. It's I would say that pretty much all of our music today is probably influenced by all those groups in the 60s.
Yeah,
I mean,
definitely.
Have you?
And to be honest with you, Dan, I don't think any of the bands really in the last 30 or 40 years have really topped the Rolling Stones or the Beatles or Led Zeppelin. Some of these bands, they have maybe one or two good songs, but, like when you compare that to how many songs the Beatles put out or Rolling Stones put out, it doesn't seem like the bands have that type of durability anymore.
Well,
No.
I think the music market has changed heavily, but even in most of the bands that we can think of, 70s, 80s, 90s, most of them don't really have the legacy that the bands in the 60s did. They might maybe down the road, but we think of, maybe Metallica, AC/DC. AC/DC, they have a pretty big legacy as well. But the music market has changed. I wouldn't say rock is completely dead now. I'd probably say it's becoming more of a niche underdog genre. But hip hop is now what the Beatles were 60 years ago. So it's,
one thing too, back in the day, the only thing you had was the top 40 on the radio. Out of Chicago, you had WLS and WCFL. And what they would do is they would play anything that became hot. So you would have the Beatles right next to like songs from Motown, or you would have show tunes, things that were big for the movies. But now I think music has become, like you say, you have all these little cliques or niche. What am I trying to say? Niche.
I'm not sure what the proper. I think the proper pronunciation is niche. I've always said niche.
Niche, yeah, niche or niche, yeah. But anyway, so now if you want to get on the radio, you have all hip hop, or you have all classic rock, or all oldies. Whereas in the old days there was a mix. But nowadays it does seem like everybody likes hip hop and rap, and I really can't distinguish those sounds.
How do you feel about that transition?
Oh, it's good for the kids enjoy it. That's the main thing. But I just kind of thought hip hop and rap would have kind of blew itself out by now. It seems like it's been around for 30 years. It doesn't seem to be that interesting of a genre to have lasted this long. Seems like you just could come up with so many bad rhymes and have that heavy pounding bass. Just seems like after a while people would get sick of it, but they don't really seem to get sick of it. Now, Brett, are you a big hip hop guy?
Love hip hop.
You
Love
do?
it. I do
too. I didn't really like hip hop until I was an adult. As a kid, I listened to a lot of punk rock and metal, I'd say, in my formative years. But I think hip hop has changed in a way, kind of how we saw rock music change. It went from being break beats and like basic rhyme schemes in the 70s to being a lot more complex and a lot more diverse. Now in hip hop, there's a debate between this melodic rap version, which we call mumble rap, which is we don't really rap anymore. We just are melodic. So we go with a tune. We're focused on lyrics. We're focused on the sound. And then there's another side of it where it's like, no, we should really focus on the lyrics. The lyrics are important. They have to be complex. I think every music genre has that. But I would say that, what would you say today? Who would be the Beatles of today in the 2000s, 2010s? Like who could you see holding that flag, that throne, that crown that the Beatles have held for a very long time?
The biggest of the big. Wow, that's a tough one. I always thought it was going to be REM. But I don't think they really put anything out that much in recent years. And Metallica, I would kind of put up there, but I don't know if they're even playing that much anymore. I don't even know who would be, for a while, groups become kind of big. Like, I thought another group that was going to just be great was the Smashing Pumpkins.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And then they seem like they just kind of broke up. It doesn't seem like these groups hang in there as long. But to be honest with you, I wouldn't even be able to tell you who the number one band is, would it be Mumford and Son or something like that?
Yeah, it's hard to say. There's not a lot of high-powered rock bands anymore. There just isn't. They're all They're all niche. They're all on alternative stations. They don't get the views that hip hop does. Actually, there's another genre of music we haven't mentioned that's also a big power weight nowadays. Country music.
Oh yeah.
Country music and hip hop are about level, like in terms of their development, in terms of their production. Rock is kind of fallen by the wayside, but country music
and that's
too.
one thing I never thought I would see in my lifetime. I just thought rock would be dominant until I die, but like you say, it seems like it just faded more and more and more. And even when you talk about the good rock bands, they're all pretty old now, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Because I was going to say Bruce Springsteen, but I mean, Bruce, he hit his peak like in the early 80s. I don't think he's big anymore.
The only one I can really think of that would have been to the caliber and the fandom of the Beatles would have been Michael Jackson. I mean, truly.
What about Bon Jovi?
Bon Jovi. Yeah.
Bon
Jovi.
I think he put out a country music album a couple years ago, didn't he? I think he did.
Aerosmith?
No, not Aerosmith. I think actually Bon Jovi did put out a country music CD, and it kind of flopped a little bit. I'm sure the middle-aged moms loved it, but
Yeah.
Well, I have students in my class. I teach public speaking, and they will do speeches on people I've never heard of before, like Weekend.
Yeah.
Weekend.
Hey, there you go.
I
You got
have
it.
no clue who this guy is.
I can't say I'm a fan of The Weekend.
Oh no. That's all right.
But the only one I would recognize, I do know Snoop Dogg. Good old Snoop Dogg. I know him from way back, but
Yeah.
a lot of these young bands coming in, and like I say, I respect them. You know, people listen to them, but it's just something I can listen to. Oh, well, I could turn the channel down.
He lived about an hour away from my uncle, Snoop Dogg.
Where does your uncle live?
Diamond Bar, California. Yeah. He does a lot for the community.
I actually just saw that Jay-Z became the first billionaire in hip-hop.
Wow. Wow.
I mean, that's maybe that's what's changed about music. Maybe it's more about making money than art anymore.
Yeah, well, I guess the problem is we could make the same argument about television or movies that it's to make a lot of money quickly, but how good it is, actually, I don't know, because I do know people made a big deal out of Game of Thrones. Did you guys watch that?
I did not.
Oh, yeah.
Did you?
I actually haven't watched the last season, but
No, I did not.
I didn't want to get disappointed.
Well, I watched it, and it was good. It was very good, but it was just not my taste. And the episode I watched, out of nowhere, they chopped this guy's hand off. And I go, I don't want to see this. So I turned it off. But everybody I knew who watched it swore by it. But in some ways, this could just be showing my age. You know, I'll be 65 in a couple of weeks, and my tastes are kind of grounded in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and a little bit the 80s. So anything coming out after 80s, you know, is just really not my taste. But I don't want to be one of these old fogies who hates everything new, because the young people like it, and that's what it's geared for, the people with money, etc. How well it will hold up in the future, like 20 years from now, people will like what's coming, you know, the music now, hip-hop, or if it will just be, yuck.
Well, you know what I've noticed is good music is good music, and if it's well produced, it will stand the test of time.
Mm-hmm.
You know? Well, I tell you what, Professor Farrell, it was great to have you on. I think if we have any tuners listening in from Holy Rosary, they're gonna want to know, when are we all going to Villa de Carlos for the end of the world?
Well, Brett, we will do it because I'm thinking about retiring in about a year.
Okay.
And then when I get back, I'll see what I was going to get going. Now, we were originally supposed to meet in their driveway of Holy Rosary, but I
Very
think that
true.
would, maybe they would consider that invasion of private
They
property.
very well could.
Arrest us all. So I was thinking maybe we could rent someplace. But are you on? Are you on?
Yeah,
You ready to do it?
I'm ready to go. I'm ready.
Okay. Well,
Oh man,
I bet you we'll get a big crowd, too, because
I-
a lot of people have asked me over the years.
I think we will. Well,
That would be a lot of fun. All right. Well, thank you very much, Brett, and thank you very much, Dan. I really give you guys credit for doing this, and I like your name. The Junto Club is great. What a Bet Franklin would be smiling upon you.
I hope he would, but we'd now like to welcome you as a member of the Junto Podcast Club.
I would like to join.
Yeah, you part of select few right now.
All right, well, you start small and you'll build up. This is a great idea, those guys. And thank you very much for having me on the program.
No
Thanks
problem.
for coming on.
It was good to have you.
We'll talk soon.
All right, have a good one.
Okay, we'll talk to you later, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Now that concludes the fourth episode of the Junto Podcast Club, Season 1. We would like to bid all of you adieu. Brett?
I'd like to bid everybody a farewell as well.